There were lights on the shores of Guadalcanal Island. They were not the glow of giant fires, and we felt rather disappointed. When we got out of the holds, we expected to see the whole world on fire, for the bombardment had been fierce indeed. Our armada, at least we thought so, was capable of tearing Guadalcanal to pieces. But on the gloomy grey morning of August 7, 1942, on the shore only in a few places flames could be seen. From afar it looked like city dumps burning, lighting our way into history. We felt anxious, but we were not frightened. I was still angry about my run-in with the sailor mess hall staff. I took too long to eat the beans issued for breakfast, and when I finally finished, I found the sailors washing the galley with exasperation. An operating room could be set up there for the wounded ashore, and the petty officer was just closing a crate of oranges, which were distributed as a kind of gift to the soldiers, to those going to battle, and I came in and demanded my share. He refused to open the crate again, so we started yelling at each other. I wanted that orange more than General Watergrift Guadalcanal. The sailor refused to comply and threatened. What a stupid thing to do, report. My behaviour to the commanding officer. Report me getting ready to spill blood among those damned coconut palms. At first I wanted to bayonet him, but I changed my mind. I simply threw him aside, tore the lid off the box, grabbed my coveted orange, and filled with a sense of victory, ran back to my comrades, ignoring the indignant shouts behind me. I was still as hot with anger as the coast of Guadalcanal when old Guppy shouted, "A first platoon, aboard! Drop the nets!" The George FIT tumbled smoothly over the waves. The nets swayed, tapping against the metal plating. The muzzle of my rifle caught my helmet and knocked it over my eyes, and far below we could see the Higginses, now cresting the waves and then falling into the troughs. They were waiting for us. Clinging to the net, I still managed to look around. Sillark Strait was full of our ships. To my left, that is, to the west of me, towered Savo Island. In front of me, to the north, partly hidden by the hulk of the Elliot, were Florida Island and Little Tulagi. I could hear the sounds of gunfire. Behind me, in other words, to the south, was Guadalcanal. Not a metre before the Higgins dangling on the water, the net ended. The next thing to do was to jump. We were all sensibly weighed down with more than 20 kilograms of weight. There was no time for indecision, because those coming down after us were already stepping on their toes. So jump, hoping that at this very moment another wave would not throw Higgins aside, leaving us to land on the bubbling water surface. But all was bypassed. I could now clearly see the waves crashing against the sides of the ships in the neighbourhood. The boats were approaching, filling up with soldiers and moving away from the big mothership again to join the countless of their kin who were circling the water like giant frolicking water bugs. Oh, all aboard! I could see now that the seemingly random movement of the boats made sense. They were lining up to attack. I crouched under the planking and felt the boat gradually turn. Its bow was now pointing toward the shore. The deck beneath me vibrated slightly. The attack had begun, and I began to pray again. I had prayed long the night before, asking the Lord and the Blessed Virgin to take care of my family and comrades if I was killed. In the vanity of my youth, I was sure I was going to die, and I was in a hurry to turn my affairs over to the Almighty, like an older brother who pats the younger brother on the back and says, "Well, John, you are now the main man of the house." It is true that my prayers were rather haphazard. I could not give myself to them with all my soul, for I was thinking only of the shore on which we were to land. In front of us were other boats carrying Marines. I imagined firing under the cover of their bodies, building a protective wall of torn, bleeding flesh. I visualized the carnage among the coconut palms, and I no longer prayed. Ears on top of my head to hear a dangerous noise, body tense in readiness to immediately jump aside. The boat bumped into the shore, rocked and stopped. In an instant I was already jumping ashore. The bright blue sky curved into a giant arch. Huge palm branches swayed gently in the wind. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. From there, everything blended together like a fog. A kaleidoscope of shape, colour, and movement ensued. I found myself lying on the sand among the tall coconut palms and realized I was partially soaked. I had advanced 20 meters into the interior of the island. There was no fighting yet. The Japanese were running. We lay ready to rush into battle, but we had no opponent. A few moments passed and the tension eased. We began to look around, surveying the exotic surroundings, and soon voices, chuckles were heard. "Hey, Lieutenant," shouted the big guy. "You can get a good meal here. I agree to fight like this." At the same time, Sergeant Narrow-Faced barked at someone who had opened a coconut. "Don't get poisoned. Don't you know that everything here can be poisoned?" Everyone laughed. The narrow-faced man understood everything, without exception, to the point of being stupidly literal. He had been instructed that the Japanese tend to set traps and can poison water supplies, so his coconuts were poisoned immediately. No one even bothered to point out to the tightwad the obvious difficulty of poisoning millions of coconuts on Guadalcanal. We just laughed and continued destroying the coconuts, cracking the shells and drinking the sweet coconut milk. The narrow-faced man could only throw angry glances at everyone. He was a master at that. A command came from somewhere far away. "Let's go." We formed into squads and marched. We left our innocence behind in Red Beach. From now on, we were different. For another 10 minutes, we were gripped by a blissful sense of joy of being, an inexpressible relief. How on earth? We had come ashore and met no enemy. As we left the white vastness of the beach and entered the shade of the coconut grove, the air defense guns rumbled behind us. The Japanese were here. There was a war going on, and we were no longer the same. We dragged ourselves across sun-bathed glades, overgrown with kupai grass. We forded rivers. Then we crossed them again in the opposite direction. We climbed hills. We trudged through the jungle, cutting our way through with machetes or following narrow, winding paths. It was a long time before we realized where we were going. At rest stops, we saw officers leaning over a map. Ah, what a map it was! It showed Red Beach. That was right. The Tenaru River. It didn't really exist, and an endless expanse of coconut thickets, marked on the map with an icon that looked more like an iris than a coconut palm. The map was the wrong map, and it was leading us into trouble from the start. The officers were alarmed. They knew we were lost. "Hey, Lieutenant, where are we headed?" "Grassy Knoll." "Where's that?" "Up ahead, where the Japanese are." This is the talk of the most naive among us. Grassy Knoll, up ahead, where the Japanese are. Indians and cowboys, cops and thieves, hide and seek. We were playing a game. Even the division commander calmly announced that dinner would be at the top of Grassy Knoll. "Let's synchronize our watches, gentlemen. The offensive has begun." Grassy Knoll is Grassy Knoll. We had a lot to learn. We had 5 months to learn it all, but only a few would make it to Grassy Knoll. The very first day began with disappointment, and with a sense of loneliness. The sounds of battle coming from behind were ominous, the faces of the officers anxious. The Japanese were closing the ring, and we poor fools thought we were pursuing them. Our clothes were drenched with sweat. The movement over the kunai overgrown areas brought us to utter exhaustion. Now, as we entered the moist coolness of the rainforest, our sweat-soaked clothes clung to our heated bodies, gripping them with cool tenacity. "Hey, Lucky," called the big man. "Why don't you lighten your load on a quart of Calvert? Stop and give us a swig." But it wasn't whiskey we all wanted at all. For the first time in my life, I was really thirsty. The heat, followed by the moisture-laden, relaxing atmosphere of the forest, seemed to have completely dried out my body. I had water in a flask, but I was afraid to touch it. No one knows when there will be an opportunity to fill it up again. We had been walking for 3 hours and had not yet seen any fresh water. A few steps further on, a river suddenly appeared before us, calmly carrying its waters to the sea. Disregarding the warning shouts, we rushed to the water. It dissolved us into itself, this river. We all became one shrieking, splashing, snorting mass, and even Lieutenant Ivy took part in this flagrant breach of military discipline. We must have been a sight exceptionally pleasing to the eye of any Japanese. The narrow-eyed men had obviously missed their chance to organize a massacre. Some of us lay on our backs in the flowing stream, which bore the lyrical name of Ilu, opened our mouths and let the moisture flow inside us like a drain. Lieutenant Ivy greedily gulped the water, scooping it up with his helmet, occasionally muttering, "Don't drink it. It may be poisoned. Don't drink until you've dissolved the purification pill." No one argued with him, continuing to indulge in a rampant orgy of thirst-quenching. "Drink, thread, drink." We moaned in languor like lovers as the water, that soft, cool, delicious water, licked the salty sweat from our bodies. Refreshed and having absorbed as much moisture as possible, we resumed our movement. Our clothes were damp. But now it was the pure wetness of water. It is impossible not to be wet in the rainforest, but water is still better than salty sweat. Night crept up unnoticed and caught us still on the march. We began to hastily organize defense. The first day passed without much incident, although we lost one man. He was coming from the flank and just disappeared. While we were setting up machine guns on top of the hill, it started to rain. It kept coming, and as we sat there silently and dully chewing the dry rations each man had taken out of his duffel bag, each was on his own, but all together we were making a dangerous voyage through the blackness of night. This night was to be a night of terror. We were bewildered, confused. We were cold and wet. We didn't know what surrounded us, and we were afraid of it. We knew nothing of the enemy and were afraid of him. We were alone, and all around us was a jungle that lived a life unknown to us, filled with sounds and movement that could well mean that the enemy was creeping closer and closer. But we regarded it all without emotion, like a stunned boxer waiting with indifference for the knockout punch. Too exhausted by the previous bout to move, too detached to worry. We felt much the same way. We had had enough of everything for the first day. One time we heard gunfire. The crackle of gunfire broke the silence of the night. We stared intensely into the darkness, but the shots stopped, and the darkness became as it had been before, silent. There was dripping from the trees. The jungle whispered something. No one. In the morning we found out how the night's shooting had ended. A corpsman had been killed, and he was shot by his own soldier. When the sentry demanded the password from the orderly, who was going back, he slightly twisted the word Lilliput out of fear and was killed. The unfortunate little fellow met eternity because of a few transposed consonants. I'll never forget the faces of his friends who buried him. In the pre-dawn silence, the sounds of their shovels were like mice scurrying. Dawn had not yet come. Lieutenant Ivy asked the company commander for permission to smoke. "Oh, I don't know if it's dawned enough," the captain replied. "Go behind that tree over there and light a match and I'll watch." The lieutenant did so. When he lit the match, we could easily see a small light. "Well, Captain?" "No." The captain shook his head. "It's still too dark." I looked at the captain. There was a look of concern on his face. I was very surprised. I was not a brave warrior, a veteran of 100 battles, but an ordinary civilian like myself. And this man was hardly more confident than the hasty sentry who had rushed to pull the trigger and shot the orderly. The captain was much older than I was, but the responsibility that rested on his shoulders and the unknown face of the coming war no doubt terrified him. He thought the tiny flames of burning matches might give away our location to the enemy, as if we were going to be burning fires all night. And in another minute it was quite light, everyone had a smoke, and so did the captain. We'd been marching all day. Grassy Knoll was still somewhere ahead, the Japanese too. We climbed slowly up the hillsides cautiously, moving sideways like land crabs or skiers, then rolled briskly down the opposite slopes. The machine gunners were tired of swearing, cursing the heavy and uncomfortable tripods that would hit them on the head. The terrain on Guadalcanal, according to our observations, consisted mostly of steel, on which the insidious demons of the jungle had spread a thin layer of treacherous silt. We had, for what seemed like forever, stamped our feet trying to steady ourselves on these untrodden hilly trails, our hands clutching at themselves as if grasping for air. Our advance, with a regularity worthy of better use, was accompanied by characteristic peculiar sounds, telling us that another machine gunner with full equipment had slipped and crashed to the ground. We were advancing on the enemy with the agility of inept circus performers. If the enemy had appeared in the damp twilight jungle, he would have dealt with us without much difficulty. The Japanese would have dealt with us as easily as our glorious ancestors dealt with their enemies. We saw no enemy. That day was dull and unmemorable. I have no reason to remember it with either joy or regret. But the night I will never forget. I woke up around midnight and saw the sky on fire. That's how I had imagined doomsday as a child. Everything around me was flooded with red light, as if emitted by the eyes of Satan. Imagine countless red traffic lights shining through the shroud of rain, and you'll understand how I saw the world when I woke up. Light was pouring in from the enemy's flare bombs. They hovered above the jungle roof, bobbing slightly on their parachutes, throwing a reddish light around them. Above them, unseen aloft, the engines hummed. Later we learned that they were Japanese naval aviation planes. We thought they were after us. In reality, They were the eyes of a powerful enemy naval armada that had entered Silek Strait. Soon we heard the sounds of cannonade. The ground beneath our feet trembled. In the distance we could see red and white flashes and the rumble of explosions. The Japanese were gaining their most remarkable victory in the history of warfare at sea. It was the Battle of Savo Island, also often referred to as the Battle of Four Seated Ducks. They sank 3 American cruisers, the Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria, the Australian cruiser Canberra, and damaged an American cruiser and destroyer. The flare bombs were intended for this particular battle. At one point, the Japanese turned on their searchlights. In general, there was no shortage of illumination. It took us less than 24 hours to get out of the rainforest, although it took us 2 days to get into it. We knew the way back. We didn't know the way back. When we emerged from the forest and began to descend the slippery slopes to the kunai grass meadows, amphibious transporters with food and water were waiting for us. Hohatun walked just in front of me. He slipped and slid down the last section of the slope, with the vicious tripod hitting him on the head. He got up and kicked it. Then he cursed. Angry, he swore with relish. Leaning over, he grabbed the tripod as if it were a living thing, and he were holding it by the throat, his hands tensed as if he were trying to strangle it. The heavy, hard thing that at that moment concentrated all the unpleasantness. The frustration, hunger, thirst, dampness, and excitement of the last 2 days. Then he flung it away. The tripod sailed through the air and landed in a belligerently protruding clump of kupai. Chuckles sat down and smoked. Other soldiers were coming down the hill, soiled from head to toe, exhausted, dragging their heavy burdens with little resemblance to the brave Marines. Fresh water and dry rations made things better. Having filled our flasks and bellies and smoked to our heart's content, we were again ready for great accomplishments. We reached the shore at dusk. We saw the mangled and smoking wrecks of ships and the absolutely empty water between Guadalcanal and Florida Island. Our fleet was gone. Gone. We stayed behind. More and more columns of men marched along the shore. Their footsteps on the sand could hardly be heard. The sun had already disappeared behind the forest. Night was falling on the land. The silhouettes of people were clearly visible against the background of the thickening darkness. In the twilight, they seemed to have lost one dimension and became shadows. These tired people moved as if bound by an invisible chain. There was no soul in them. They walked automatically, like zombies. Behind them, the dull light of the reflected sun could be seen low just above the horizon. Despair was replaced by hopelessness. I was glad when it became completely dark. My company marched silently along the shore. We took up a defensive position. We hastily set up firing points and turned our barrels toward the sea. We put out sentries and went to bed. It is pleasant to fall asleep to the monotonous, lulling sound of the surf beating against the shore. The next day we were bombed. But it wasn't terrible, and it was nothing compared to what still awaited us. Alert! Someone shouted, and we heard the sound of engines approaching. They were very high up, about a dozen bombers. They followed over our heads in a perfect V formation and dropped their load over Henderson Field. And we shouted and danced around, expressing our delight and contempt for the enemy. We were fools. Those bombs were not meant for us, but for our comrades on the airfields. We heard the explosions and felt the earth shake under our feet, but we remained safe and could not contain our childish joy. Our foolishness was born of a false sense of security. We laughed and threw our fists at the departing bombers as if we had taken the blow and forced them to retreat. Yes, we had a lot to learn. And then we found a Japanese warehouse. It was located not far from where we were stationed on the beach. There were crates of excellent Japanese beer, bottles of much stronger drinks neatly packed in straw skirts. Soon the dirt road parallel to the shoreline became the Eastern Freeway, with grinning Marines carrying a nice load. There was food in the warehouse, too. Flour, rice, and small cans of fish heads. That awful Japanese delicacy I thought was a Japanese delicacy. But nobody was interested in food. By the way, each ward was responsible for its own food. We had flour, canned goods, sugar, and coffee, all taken from the stacks of food hastily unloaded from the transports. Our ship caught fire the day we went ashore. A burning airplane crashed right onto the deck. We did not have a battalion kitchen, and small squad kitchens were stationed all along the beach. The supply was the best. Everything that could be stolen anywhere was delivered here. Considering the above and the amount of sake and beer, We had a delightful week. And then the liquor ran out, and the Major took control of the food supply. What a wonderful week it was, a very delicious way to fight a war. Chuckles, Big Boy, Runner and I buried our liquor supply deep in the sand, where the sea licked it with its long, wet tongue and where it was cool. It was our inviolable stockpile, and no one but us could touch it. So the four of us drank almost all of it without sharing it with anyone. It was only very rarely that a drink would awaken our generosity. Then our regiment would arrive. We sat and talked about everything. It was not easy to pour sake from large, heavy bottles into mugs, so we passed the bottle to each other, taking turns sipping from it like Indians smoking a peace pipe. But this method of drinking required a certain dexterity. The first thing to do was to clasp the large, uncomfortable bottle between the knees, then bend over it so that the lips were around the neck of the bottle, after which it was only necessary to roll over on one's back and let the cool, white liquid flow down the throat. It was so good. I won't say I had a fine palate, but every sip of sake was accompanied by an unparalleled sensation. I didn't know it felt so good to drink the enemy's wine. We drank a lot. After one of these meetings, I, not too firmly on my feet, retired to my sleeping quarters. In other words, I took a couple of steps away from the guys sitting in a circle and collapsed into a small hollow I had dug in the ground beforehand. High above me, palm branches moved languidly, giving the impression that the warm, starry tropical night was barely audibly breathing. I fell asleep. I woke up feeling that some large insects were buzzing and whistling somewhere nearby. After a few minutes, I realized that they were bullets, turned over on the other side and fell asleep again, quite upset that the Japanese had found us after all. Such was the power of sake. In the morning, the reason for the firing became clear. It turned out that the fire was conducted by 2 companies of the 5th Regiment, mistaking each other for the enemy. The storyteller concluded, and I believed him immediately and unconditionally. He did not need authority. He had theory, the only authority I needed on Guadalcanal. The beer went very well in the morning. It was full of the coolness of the night and the darkness of the sea beneath the sands. Stump's beer didn't last long. It wasn't that he drank a lot, it was just that he drank it too fast, though perhaps it was the same thing. He struggled to his feet, stepped out of the shadows, and collapsed the moment the sun touched his head. We carefully covered his body with palm leaves and placed an empty sake bottle on his chest. He looked like some kind of Shinto shrine. Then the big guy suddenly realized that he was dressed in a completely inappropriate manner. He was wearing no pants. The lack of such an important article of clothing, even among people who were not overly concerned with propriety, seemed to cause him real pain. He struggled to his feet, found his pants, and staggered to the water with them. "Hey, big guy, where are you going?" "I want to put my pants on." "In the water?" The big guy grinned stupidly, showing a set of big, strong teeth. "Hey, I'm supposed to wear pants in the ocean." His behavior was truly inimitable. Whenever a wave rolled off the shore, he would put his left leg into his pant leg. Then, with the exaggerated caution of a drunk, he would start pulling his pants up. While he was carefully balancing on his right leg, another wave would roll in and slap him on his pink arse. Each time he would rise with great dignity and repeat the procedure again. The wave would merrily roll in and knock him down on the sand again, once or twice. He managed to balance for a few seconds on that treacherous right foot and look back, with an uncertain smile, as if to see if his old buddy the wave was there. It always turned out to be there. Such was the power of Japanese beer. After the first day we were bombed regularly, at least once and sometimes several times a day. Enemy ships began to appear in the strait. Ignoring any possible rebuff from our side, they approached the shore and shelled us. The Japanese were obviously serious. To protect the airfield Hydersop field from the enemy, seriously intending to fight for Guadalcanal, it was necessary to organize special night patrols. The first day our company was ordered to provide men for the patrols was the end of drunkenness and idleness. We ran out of liquor that day. I was among those who travelled inland through coconut groves and kupai thickets to the point where we were to defend Hydersop field. Directly in front of me stepped Backless. He was a tall and boisterous fellow from Michigan, who had the uncanny property of irritating intolerably any of the company who followed him. The odd thing was that the ass seemed to be really lacking. His thighs were so long and flat that his cartridge case kept threatening to slide off his belt right to his ankles. There was no curve of bone or flesh to hold it up. Reckless marched without bending the knees of his abnormally long and thin, matchstick-like legs, and what was most annoying was that, where his pants were supposed to bulge out, hugging the bulges of his buttocks, they seemed to even fall inward. And if you add to this a thin, even, perhaps, squeaky girl's voice, you can imagine why the one who was lucky enough to be in line behind this man very quickly came to a frenzy. Personally, it was with great difficulty that I was able to restrain myself from poking Bezodogo with a bayonet in the place where a normal man's ass should be. That day we bayoneted him and walked through the Kupai toward the forest, behind which the round red sun had just fallen. Corporal Gladkolitsi was pacing behind Bezodogo. Smooth-faced was drunk. He had finished the rest of the sake. He was walking slightly swaying and seemed quite content with life, when suddenly he lowered his rifle, with a shriek rushed at Bezodogo and poked him with his bayonet in the part below his back. At the first moment we thought that Gladkolitsi had killed him, for Bezodoy emitted a cry, which can only be the cry of a dying man. Fortunately for the soldier, the limited size of the target prevented the drunken corporal from hitting the target accurately. The bayonet pierced his pants without even scratching the flesh. The unfortunate man did not suffer at all from the sharp surface of the bayonet, but from the hard muzzle of the rifle. The smooth-faced man found it so amusing that he had to sit down to laugh. When he stood up again, the artillery battery, standing somewhere in the jungle, gave its voice. Our 75mm howitzers were firing at an unknown target. As a matter of fact, they were firing quite often, and one could never tell for sure whether they were just shooting through the territory or were firing at the enemy. But the sudden rumbling of the field batteries always got on one's nerves, even if one knew for certain that the guns were their own. The smooth-faced man bared his small, even teeth, turned his rifle in the direction of the firing and opened fire with a beastly growl. That was the end of Corporal Gladkalikarisco's career on Guadalcanal. He was led away under guard. But he still decided to have the last word. When they put him in the back seat of the captain's jeep, he rose to his feet and with great dignity declared, "I will not ride in a captain's car." At that very moment, the jeep jumped forward and Smoothface was thrown out of the vehicle. Having made an intricate somersault, he landed, but unsuccessfully, he broke his ankle and was sent to the hospital. That same night, one of the very rare transports landed at the airfield, and he was evacuated to New Zealand. There he was treated, kept in the brig for a while, and eventually released to enjoy the luxuries of Auckland. Smoothface's broken ankle, though not a wound received in fair combat, was still the very first of those light wounds so coveted by all veterans. Superfluous holes and cuts in the body took a man out of combat and back to the many benefits of civilization. It was still light when we left the airfield and entered the darkness of the jungle. It was like coming from a noisy lighted street into the solemn twilight of a church, only there was no smell of incense and no sense of closeness to the shrines. We were told to spread out with a distance of 10 meters. I don't know how many men were in the chain. I guess about 100, of which about 30 were from our company. Such things we never knew for sure. We only knew that in front of us was a dark jungle where the enemy was probably hiding, and behind us was the airfield on which the military situation on Guadalcanal depended. We set about digging single trenches in the jungle soil. It was like digging in a compost heap that had only been laid down 10,000 years ago. Underneath the top layer of rot was a thick, dark loam. We were about to finish the job when night suddenly fell upon the land, as if a giant black shadow had descended from the jungle roof to the ground. We slid into our foxholes and lay low. All we could do was wait. It was a darkness without time. It was an impenetrable darkness. To my right and left was something huge, shapeless and ugly, created by my imagination. Thank God there was no light, so I couldn't see it. I couldn't see anything at all, but I didn't dare close my eyes, lest the darkness creep up on me and suffocate me. I could only listen. I became all ears and listened to the slightest signs of life around me. I could hear the gathering, thickening darkness, which in time began to seem alive. The enemy was everywhere. I could hear the Japanese moving around me, calling my name. With my mouth ajar, I sat in a trench nestled among the roots of a giant tree and felt like I was going crazy. I hadn't bothered to look up and get a proper look at the crown of the tree until it was completely dark, and now it seemed to me that there were more Japanese than leaves on the tree. The whole world turned against me, and soon even my own body proved to be a traitor. First one of my legs turned into a sneaking Japanese, and then the other. My arms followed, and soon my heart was left alone. It was me. I was my heart. It lay there and trembled. I was trembling in a pit filled with the howls of decay, while all around me the ugly creatures, the spawn of darkness, rushed about, joining forces to capture my heart. How long had this been going on? An eternity. There was no time. Time dissolved into a black void. There was only emptiness, and it was something. It was a singular being, a spirit, a consciousness. The day came very quickly, as if a light had been turned on in a dark theatre hall. Dawn came, and I was myself again. Now I could see the silhouettes of my companions to my right and left, and I was surprised to find that the tree under which I was positioned was not threatening at all, but on the contrary, quite peaceful and friendly. Now I know why people burn fires. Intrusive, demanding, and reproachful was the Major's demeanour as he drove his jeep through the coconut grove, stopping at each squad's field kitchen to sort out supplies. From afar, he looked like a scout leader reprimanding his subordinates who had eaten lunch at breakfast. The Major's journey meant the end of feeding in the squads. Our escape from battalion authority was cut short, and a battalion galley was organised, but the Major found very little food supplies that could be stacked in a pyramidal tent, specially erected for this purpose in the interior of the island 200 metres from the shore. All that could be eaten had already been eaten, and we were faced with a diet consisting chiefly of rice alone. The provisions belonged to the enemy, as did the wooden bowls from which we ate. We preferred them to our own bowls, with their unpleasant peculiarity of giving any food a metallic taste. We ate a cup of rice each for breakfast and dinner. One day one of the Marines complained to the doctor that there were worms in the rice. "They are already dead," laughed the doctor, "and can't hurt you. Eat in peace and be happy that you are given fresh meat." He was joking, and at the same time completely serious. No one protested. And everyone decided that the doctor had a great sense of humour. The day after we started our rice diet, the Major's extreme discretion became clear. We were ordered to move to new positions on the west bank of the Tenaru River. We were ordered to make haste. From one day to the next, the enemy was expected to appear. The Tenaru River looked green and ominous. It crawled across the flat plain like a poisonous snake. It was called a river, though in reality it was not. Like most of the water streams on the islands of Oceania, it was nothing more than a creek, only 30 metres wide. Perhaps it was not even a stream, because it did not flow always and not all the way, and rarely reached its final point, the sea. Where it flowed into Aeroy Bottom Bay, there was a sandy spit about 40 metres wide. The width of the spit varied depending on tidal currents. Sometimes winds and currents would cause the river level to rise, and it would creep over the spit and into the sea. Usually Tenaru was a standing marsh, with foul water and some vile vegetation floating on its surface. An ominous green, as I have said. If there are river deities, Tenaru was patronized by some very dark, malevolent. Our two platoons, one machine gunned by gentlemen and the other by chuckles, took up positions about 300 metres upstream from the sandbar. Being entrenched, we were able to observe the part of the spit that was considered enemy. The fact is that Tenaru was the front line. On our side, on the western shore, were concentrated positions of Marines. On the other bank, no man's land, coconut groves, through which enemy units would have to pass, attacking us. The Japanese would have to force the river in front of our positions or move along the sand spit on our left, which was well guarded by our men, aided by machine guns and barbed wire. They could also try to pass on our right flank, about 100 metres south of us, before turning to the narrowest section of the Tenaru, where there was a suspended wooden bridge. The firing point for the gentleman's machine gun was exceptionally well chosen. The coconut grove on the other bank was perfectly exposed. We set it up first, leaving Hosutun's machine gun and mine 20 metres downstream, protected by a single row of barbed wire stretched across the steep riverbank. We decided to set it up the next day. The gentleman's machine gun nest came out wide and deep, a 3 by 3 metre hole, 1.7 deep. We wanted the machine gunner to be able to stand while firing, and such a pit was a good cover from bombs. We worked like the damned, naked to the waist. We nevertheless sweated desperately, and still we did not manage to finish the excavation on the first day. When night fell, the excavation was mostly finished and the foundation for the machine gun was made. The next day we had to build a roof of logs. In such a half-finished fortification, we felt unprotected and therefore insecure. In the darkness, the heaps of earth we had thrown up seemed particularly ominous. But we had not yet known real battles and their suddenness. So sitting on the newly piled mounds of soft, warm earth and carefully hiding the smouldering flames of Japanese cigarettes, we had no misgivings. We just sat, smoked and talked softly. The only thing that bothered us was the darkness coming from all sides, a feeling that returned every night and disappeared at dawn. No one went to sleep. Stars appeared in the dark sky, and that was enough to keep everyone awake. Why waste time on such a bright night? Suddenly a pulsating letter V appeared in the river to our right upstream. It seemed to be moving downstream. At the low point of the V were two small, round, greenish lights placed near each other. Jaw Nuts whistled and unloaded his rifle into this something. To our right a cannonade began. It was the Marines of Company G firing at the letter V. The bullets slammed soundly into the water. The strange letter V disappeared. The stars disappeared, and the night became pitch black again. The men began to prepare for sleep, wrapped themselves in cloaks and laid down on the ground a few meters from the pit. Hohotun and I remained on watch. Lights are flickering. Swaying lights flashed across the river in the coconut grove. Lanterns or searchlights. There was also, from the sound of it, a truck passing somewhere. Something was clearly going on there. The sight, I must admit, was fantastic. Who knows, maybe we were about to wake up and see a ready-made railroad station on the other side of the swamp, proudly called a river. Coconut Grove was a no-man's land. The enemy might be there, but from experience in jungle warfare, it was safe to say that only a suicidal man would make his presence known with lights and trucks. It's like yelling at the top of your voice, "We're here." "Who's there?" Nuhotun shouted. The darkness continued to be cut by dancing beams. "Who's there?" he roared. "Answer me, or I'll make you." The lights went out. This was too much. No one was asleep. First the mysterious letter V in the river, and now these incomprehensible lights. We excitedly clamoured, warming our souls with the warmth of our voices. Far to the left a machine gun line sounded. They were shooting somewhere on the sand spit. Then we heard an explosion. Another. A third. They were followed by individual rifle shots. They were joined by heavy mortars behind us. The mortars spit out shells which, flying over our heads, exploded with a deafening rumble on the opposite side of the river. All in all, the fire was rapidly increasing, and it came to us. In a moment we were firing too. We were completely unorganized, didn't realize that we had to spread out, and all huddled around the open pit, as if it were our home. There were some desperate squeals right in front of us. We figured the bird concert had been triggered by people showing up. I assisted the gentleman in firing, though I was not his assistant. He was aiming at the opposite side of the river, convinced that the Japanese were preparing to cross it. The squeals had ceased. Tell them, said the gentleman calmly, to cease firing. Tell them to wait until the birds are disturbed and noisy again. A cautious man is sure to take advantage of such excellent cover. They will go from there. I was glad I had gotten at least some orders. I did not at all like to stand in the hole and watch the gentleman shoot. I crawled to the surface and relayed his words. Everyone ignored the sound advice and kept firing. Then there was a momentary lull, and I, who until that moment had had no opportunity to engage in a firefight, drew my pistol. I leaned against a pile of earth, pointed my hand with the gun into the darkness and began to squeeze the trigger. It wasn't until I ran out of ammo that I heard the big guy's angry voice. "Nah, damn you, Lucky. Didn't you think of anything better to do than to shoot over your comrade's ear? You might as well have blown half my head off, you Jersey dumbass." I only laughed, and Chuckles crawled closer to me and whispered, "Let's get that machine gun." We crawled along the shore. It was impossible to walk. Bullets seemed to fly from all sides. Hohotun took the gunner's place, and I crouched beside him, ready to fulfill my duties as an assistant. We had enough ammunition. Long ribbons for 250 rounds were in green boxes. Hohotun fired. The machine gun broke out of his not at all weak hands and fell forward, pushing its nose into the mud, knocking down the flame arrestor and showering our neighborhood with bullets. "Now, damn yellow belly." Hotun swore. He was cursing a very specific corporal who had assembled and set up our gun, and had done so sloppily that the tripod had fallen apart on the first shot. I slid down the slope and dragged everything back into place, clutching the machine gun parts with all my might. "He's all right," I reported to Crestfallen. His response was another shot right under my nose. They say in the heat of battle, all hell breaks loose. When it is said for the first time, it is a correct, surprisingly accurate description. When it is said for the millionth time, it wears out its meaning and suffers the fate of all good sayings. It becomes a hackneyed cliché. But within 5 minutes of the first machine gun burst, after the first enemy flare that flooded the battlefield with an unreal greenish light and died, surrendering to the onslaught of night, within the first 5 minutes after that, all hell was indeed breaking loose. Everyone was firing. The most varied calibers wove their voices together in the general cacophony of battle. But it wasn't orchestration. It wasn't a horrible and yet inexplicably beautiful symphony of death, as rearguard columnists sometimes write. Here was cacophony, dissonance, wildness, complete absence of rhythm and any boundaries, everyone firing with whatever was at hand. There was rumbling, scraping, screeching, whistling, honking, roaring, moaning and hissing. It was hell in here, and yet each weapon had its own voice, and it was strange how clearly the trained ear distinguished it, picking it out unmistakably from the mass, even though that voice was interrupted or sounded in unison with a dozen others, and even as its own machine gun spat and coughed, and danced and shook in a fit of choleric rage. The slap of mortars firing shells and the rumble of explosions, the jerky yapping of machine guns and the more frequent, harsh rattle of Browning automatic rifles, the heavy clatter of large-caliber machine guns, the whoosh of 75mm howitzers, the crackle of rifle rounds, the bullets of 37mm anti-tank guns firing direct fire at the advancing enemy. All these sounds contained certain information and meant a lot to the understanding ear, even if that ear was almost deafened by the infernal noise of battle. So our ears, having become accustomed, distinguished new sounds from the general chorus of voices. The lighter pops of the Japanese rifles, the gurgling of their very high-speed automatic rifles, the hiccups of the light mortars. To our left, arcs of tracer bullets appeared over the enemy bank. The distance and the general cacophony around made them inaudible, as if they had been fired in the land of the deaf. "Look at that," I muttered. "An Indian machine gun?" "Yeah, but those tracer bullets are no good. Good thing we don't have any. Whoever's firing them is easy to spot." They did find him. Targeted machine gun fire finished the poor guy off quickly. Their bullets penetrated the sandbags, punched through the water-cooling shroud of his machine gun, and right through the heart. They killed him, killed the Indian kid, the unflappable boxer from Pittsburgh. He froze with lead in his heart, keeping his finger on the trigger. He was dead, but he had killed many enemies. They had wounded his aide. They blinded him. But he fought to the last man. The Marine Corps awarded him the Navy Cross, and Hollywood made a movie about him and the battle on the Tenaru River. As I understand it, America needed a hero, preferably alive, and the Indian was dead. That second guy was certainly a hero. No one doubted that, but we were truly sorry that the Indian didn't get anything. This was the first organized attack by the Japanese on Guadalcanal. It was the first time American soldiers faced the Japanese supermen in open combat. The supermen drove a bullet through an Indian kid's heart, but he fired 200 rounds at them. How could the Marines forget the Indian? We had all sorts of problems with tracer ammunition. Now we took turns firing, and I did the pointing. The tracer bullets were coming right at me. They came out of nowhere like they were coming out of the darkness of the night. You couldn't see them coming. One moment they were gone, and the next they were here dancing and circling around us, bright sparks, particles of hellfire. They flew toward me, and time stood still. I'm sure there weren't many of them, maybe just a few, but time froze as I tried to dodge them. Hotun, I said, I think we'd better change positions. They're obviously taking aim. Maybe we should keep moving. Then they won't see us, and they'll think we have more guns than we do. Hotun nodded. He loosened the machine gun mounts and pulled it out of the tripod. Hotun lay down and pulled the tripod toward him. I also lay down and carefully placed the machine gun on my chest. We crawled slowly, moving like swimmers on our backs, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. We had tried to move as silently as we had when we stole a case of beer from a diner in North Carolina. But now the noise, especially if it came at a moment's lull, could attract enemy fire from the other side of the river, if, of course, there was anyone there. The fact was that we did not know exactly where the enemy was. We heard noises, saw ogpies and fired at them. We felt shells exploding on our side, heard the whistle of bullets, but we couldn't be sure of their origin. As we crawled to a new position, there was no enemy fire. We set up the machine gun and resumed firing, orienting ourselves to the sounds on the opposite bank as before. We stayed in one place for 15 minutes, then changed position again. This is how we spent the rest of the battle, moving and firing. As dawn broke, it was as if a giant mortar had been fired. Two events coincide of our mortars and the appearance of light. We could now see that there was no sign of life in the coconut grove across from us. There were bodies, but no living enemy. But to our left, on the ocean side, we could see the remnants of the attacking Japanese units. We saw the surviving soldiers fleeing and our mortars were firing after them. We continued to fire first at the rear of the enemy, then moving them closer to our lines, thus forcing the remaining enemy to leave cover after cover, only to be immediately destroyed by our shells. We saw them darting between the trees. The gentleman's machine gun was in an extremely favourable position for longitudinal fire. He was taking full advantage of it. He was firing in long bursts, but we were now out of the game, very far away, on the extreme right flank. There was nothing we could do to change a situation that was already under control. "No, cease fire," shouted someone from G Company to the gentleman. "Here comes the 1st Battalion." A battalion of Marines passed over the bridge on our right and headed into the coconut grove. Next they will go toward the ocean. On the left, the sand spit was crossed by light tanks, leading a counterattack. The Japanese were being driven into a coffin. Everyone had already begun to forget about the battle, carried away by the spectacle of carnage, when a shout ran along our line. A group of Japanese appeared on the opposite bank, running toward us. Their appearance caused general consternation, and so much so that no one fired a shot. Rolling out of our stupor, we scattered to the trenches. I jumped to the machine gun that Ho-Ho-Toon and I had left on the bank. I started firing, pouring bursts of fire into the opposite bank as if I were holding a hose. All but one of them fell. The first one collapsed as if he had been cut in half. The others fell after running a few steps with shouts and groans. Our machine gun was out of action again, and I grabbed my rifle. I remembered that it didn't have a belt on it. It had been left near the gun. The surviving Japanese had managed to get pretty far away when I caught sight of him, and I could clearly see his back. Broad, slouching. He seemed to have thrown back his sack. I fired, and the Japanese ceased to exist. Perhaps I didn't kill him, for almost everyone had regained their wits and taken up arms. But I've always boasted that it was my doing. Perhaps the bullet that struck him between the shoulder blades showed mercy. After all, he was running so desperately toward an inevitable and terrible end. Dark nights, starvation, and slow dissolution into the jungle. But at the time, mercy was the last thing on my mind. The war had moved into the jungle. The boys of the 1st Battalion were mopping up. Sometimes they'd drive a Japanese man out on us. He would run to the river bank hoping to hide, not knowing we were in front of him. We, the victors, numerous and perfectly armed units, waited and thirsted for, so we shot a few more men and were very sorry that there were no more targets. Everyone was seized with fever, and on the sand spit the last nail was being hammered into the coffin of the Japanese. Some Japanese were jumping into the strait and trying to swim away from the grove of terror. They acted like lemmings. They could not return. Their heads were clearly visible on the horizon. They were being killed by the Marines on the shore. The Marines lay sprawled out on the warm sand and fired at their heads. The battle was over. That night, under a bright moon, the mysterious V appeared again in the river. Green lights flickered malevolently. Someone fired a shot at the cursed litter. The crackle of rifle shots rolled along the line. The letter V disappeared. We waited tensely. No one came. Lieutenant Ivy reached us in the morning. He sat down on the fallen trunk of a coconut palm and told us what had happened. He kept smoking and staring at the river for some reason. There were hard creases in the corners of his eyes. For some reason on Guadalcanal, everyone's eyes changed. They became larger, rounder, clearer. The latter was especially noticeable in brown-eyed people. Their eyes took on a bright golden-brown colour, like that of an Irish setter. "They were trying to get through the spit," said the lieutenant. There were over 1,000 of them, and we only had one row of wire and machine guns. You should have seen the stack of them in front of Nail-Biter's machine gun. 3 bodies high, no less. They were completely out of their minds. They weren't even firing. Then he stopped and finally looked at us. We heard gunshots here. What happened? We told him. He listened, nodding, but he didn't hear anything. He was still mentally there, on the sandbar where the shrieking horde was moving. Then he gave us the figures of our losses. Company I had lost about 12 killed and more wounded. 4 or 5 dead were in our platoon as well. 2 of them were hacked to death. A group of Japanese scouts found them sleeping peacefully in a trench on the beach and chopped them to pieces. When you find out who died, it is not always immediately sad. If it is not about the closest comrades, it is difficult to feel deep feelings, crushing bitterness of loss. And now, listening to the lieutenant calling the names of the dead, I had to put a mask of inconsolable grief on my face, to dress my heart in a mourning colour, because I was shocked to look inside myself and not find grief there. And to avoid feeling like a monster, I chose to pretend to fake grief. So did everyone else. It wasn't until I heard the name of the doctor who joked about the wormy rice that I felt a piercing pain in my heart. Lieutenant Ivy stood up and, stubbornly looking into the river, spoke. "I've got to go. I've got to write these damn letters." He turned abruptly and strode away. That morning we set up a second machine gun nest, and then Big Boy and I snuck ashore. Our regiment's fire killed about 900 Japanese. Most of them were lying in heaps in front of the firing points on the sand spit, as if they were dying in large groups rather than alone. Souvenir hunters scurried between them. They moved cautiously, as if fearing unknown traps, but nevertheless did not stop ridding the dead bodies of their possessions. Ammunition had changed in warfare, and that was the only thing that distinguished the souvenir hunting marine from Hector, freeing the slain Patroclus from the borrowed armour of Achilles. One of the marines was methodically pacing among the dead bodies with a pair of tongs. He had made the observation that the Japanese had a great penchant for gold teeth. He peered into each mouth. He would unclench the jaws with all the skill of an experienced Park Avenue dentist, then carefully, very carefully, lest, God forbid, he hurt himself or get infected, he would pull out anything shiny. He kept his gold teeth in a tobacco pouch that he always wore around his neck like an amulet. We called him Souvenir. The thought of him and the other trophy seekers, when I returned from the shore, had a very natural progression. I thought that beyond the river were quite undeveloped deposits of souvenirs to which I had every right to lay claim. As I shot at the Japanese running along the riverbank, I distinctly saw something gleam as the first one fell. I assumed it was the sun illuminating an officer's badge. If he really was an officer, he was bound to have a sabre. This most valuable of all possible spoils of war I set out to obtain. I climbed through the barbed wire and rolled down to the river. I left my clothes at the water's edge and, feeling like a schoolboy who had run away to swim on a warm day, slipped into the water. I had a bayonet in my teeth, a schoolboy imagining himself a bloodthirsty pirate. I swam breaststroke, but no enemy fire would have made me plunge my face into the stinking mud, which by pure misunderstanding was called a river. The water was thick with all sorts of... I swam with my whole body shuddering, my neck stretched out like a swan and my head held high, feeling the cold of the metal in my mouth and saliva flowing so intensely that my bayonet was about to slip. I carefully circled the large body of a Japanese soldier lying in the water. It swayed gently like a boat tied to the shore. The body was strangely bloated, but as I got closer I realized that his shirt was stuffed with rice, and his pants were loaded with it, which he had tied at the knees with straps to keep the rice from falling out. He was hungry, I thought, and suddenly felt sympathy for the poor guy. At that time my feet touched the muddy bottom. It was about 3 meters to the shore. My feet had fallen so deeply into the mud that I was even worried whether I had fallen into the mire. The sticky mud reached almost to my knees and made slurping noises with every step. The little crabs, recognizing my superiority, scurried away in panic. Dead bodies were scattered throughout the grove. Tropics are tropics, and the bodies were already beginning to bloat. I was horrified to see hordes of flies swarming over them. Black, buzzing streams flowed from everywhere, from mouths, eyes, ears. The beating of myriads of tiny wings created a monotonous, low sound. Here the flies were in complete control of the situation. They were masters of the battlefield. It was the way the tropics dealt with piles of rotting flesh. I no longer felt the joy of victory, but the horror of what I had seen. I suddenly realized that flies could be crawling over my curled body right now, and quite possibly soon would be. Trying hard not to panic, I walked back to the riverbank and slid into the water. But still tentatively, I freed one of the bodies from my field binoculars and bayonet, which I hung around my neck. The saber I never found. None of the dead were officers. Back, I swam fast, trying to get as far away from the field of dead men as possible. When I emerged from the river, the comrades who had covered my sortie, waiting with rifles in their hands, mistook the grimace of disgust that had settled firmly on my face for an expression of triumph. They scrutinized my trophies. Then I went out to eat. When I returned, I noticed a group of Marines, mostly from Company G, busily discussing something on the riverbank. The runner headed toward them with my new field binoculars. As I approached, he was still staring intensely into the binoculars. His face was contorted with a grimace of terror. I took the binoculars from him and pointed them at the opposite bank of the river, where I saw a crocodile devouring a Japanese man who had stocked up on rice with gusto. At first I watched with a kind of perverse delight, but when the green predator got to the entrails, it occurred to me that in this river and in this very spot, some half an hour ago, was my own body. I felt weak in my knees and hastily lowered the binoculars. That night the letter V appeared in the river again. Everyone around us was geeking and hooting, but this time no one fired a shot. Now we knew it was a crocodile. Behind him, 3 more Vs moved, but smaller. They were crunching their prey with a loud crunch, keeping us awake, and there was a terrible odour that kept us awake. Even if we covered our heads with blankets, which was the only way to escape the mosquitoes, the stench penetrated even through this barrier. Surprisingly, it is the smell that can drive a person insane faster than any other stimulus. It's impossible to hide from it. If you do not want to see something, you can close your eyes. If the sound is irritating, plug your ears. And only from the smell there is no protection. You can only run away from it. And since there was nowhere to run, we were tormented by the inability to sleep. We never shot at the crocodiles, though they returned to their meal day after day, until the remaining bodies of the enemy on the opposite bank were gathered together and burned. The funeral pyre was visible from a distance. We did not shoot at the crocodiles as we considered them a kind of river patrol. Having tasted enough of human flesh, they had clearly gotten hungry and were now patrolling the Tenaru on a daily basis. We were sure that the enemy would not dare attempt to cross the river when these gentle creatures were in it. If he did dare, he would still fail to reach his destination. Based on our fragmentary knowledge of crocodile behavior, we built a barbed wire fence to keep the voracious creatures from reaching us. Sometimes, if the night was particularly dark, it seemed that a huge crocodile was somewhere nearby, like the crocodile with the clock inside that chased Captain Hook in Peter Pan. So over time we even grew to like crocodiles and tried not to disturb them, and none of us ever swam across the Tenaru again. The victory, called the Battle of Hell's Point, was not at all as impressive as we had imagined. It was one of many ordinary battles on Guadalcanal, and not the hardest. But for us it was the first, so we took the result as a triumph. The present is always the best, if you do not compare it with the past and do not think about the future. However, it was time to come down from the cloudy heights and return to everyday life. The enemy's attacks soon resumed, and became much longer, more persistent and diverse. They were to be expected from the air, from the sea and from the land, and they were separated from each other by periods of tedious, intense boredom, which exhausted a man, drank all the juices from his soul and body, as we ourselves sucked out the contents of a stick of sugar cane, leaving only nothing but the flames of the fire, not suitable for anything but a crumpled shell. The interplay of trials and boredom bred terror. The former shook a man like the wind shakes the tops of trees. The latter corroded him like water erodes the soil between roots. Each new battle left a man even more stunned than the previous one, and each period of boredom, representing as much time as there was for fears, made the soil under the yogi less firm, and the roots in it did not hold as firmly as one would like. Sometimes the shock was the last one. A man, maddened by the incessant shelling from the sea, could crawl into his trench, take out a gun, put it to his temple and end the nightmare around him. A man could not stand the howl of an enemy airplane diving, seemingly right at him, jumped out into the open and ran away. It was horror, wild fear that threw away all arguments of reason with the hot hands of panic. I've seen it twice, and twice more I almost had an attack of something like that myself. But to be fair, it was rare, and there were few panic victims. But courage became commonplace. It created a kind of club, a corporation, as is the case with other quite ordinary things to which people for various reasons attach great importance. I mean money, charity and the like. It is on the mundane that the exceptional rests. When bombs or shells from Japanese ships fell on our muddy trenches, they became clubs of courage. A certain protocol had to be followed, and it seemed only natural that a poor man who succumbed to momentary panic would elicit an embarrassed silence or a delicate cough. Everyone began to look the other way, like millionaires shocked by the sight of their fellow man borrowing $5 from the waiter. But there was more charity in our clubs, I think. We didn't get all high and mighty about our exclusivity. We were all under God. Today you, tomorrow me. A month passed. It seemed to us that there were as many bombs and shells falling on our heads as there were flies around. 3 times a day and every Sunday morning the coconut grove was filled with the whistle and rumble of explosions. They sounded like the roar of a giant. And at night, Charlie's washing machine took over. Washing machine was the name of a Japanese airplane that made regular night, marauding flights over our positions. Its engines made a sound very similar to the rumbling of a running washing machine. Perhaps the Charlie was not alone, but there was always only one airplane in the sky at night. There was no need for more for a job like this. They say the barking of a dog is more terrifying than its bites. Similarly, the noise of the Charlie's engines sowed more fear than the heavy blows of the bombs. After waiting out the fall of the bombs, one could take a breath with relief, knowing that now the airplane would surely fly away. But the muffled buzzing of the washing machine circling our positions with a persistence worthy of better use kept us in suspense for a long time. As long as Charlie wanted, or could, only at dawn he would fly away. At that time he could be followed by our planes, and at daylight he was no longer invisible to our air defense batteries. Charlie killed few men, but like Macbeth, he killed those who were asleep. The hardest test was always the bombardment from the sea. Enemy warships, usually cruisers, sometimes battleships, stood within range of their shells. It was impossible to see them at night, and not much easier during the day, since they were several kilometers from the coastline. Our airplanes could not get up at night to give them a decent reception. Our 75mm howitzers were as effective against them as a scarecrow against a modern rifle. The enemy had everything they needed. Far out to sea we saw the flashes of heavy guns. We could hear the muffled sounds of gunfire, and through the darkness of the night, heavy shells were coming at us. The explosions made the ground shake under our feet, even if they were far enough away. Your stomach clenched as if it were clenched by a monstrous hand, and you tried to breathe, but you couldn't. That's what it feels like when a soccer player collapses heavily to the ground and the air is blown out of him. A flash, the sound of gunfire, a howl. They lower their sights. The shells are falling closer. This one's right next to them. Sandbags are falling. I don't hear a shell. They say it's the shell you can't hear. Where is he? Shit, where the hell did it go? Slash, sound. Thank God it went higher. It's not ours yet. Dawn lighted the dark river a little. They're coming. The planes based on the patch behind us rise up and begin pursuit. We crawl out of the trenches. Someone says he is grateful for such a long night shelling. If the shelling from the sea had ceased, we could have waited for an attack on land. Someone else calls the smart man an idiot. They're having an argument. But we don't care anymore. In daylight, there is nothing to worry about except the bombing, except the heat, the mosquitoes, and the rice in our stomachs. The eyes become more round. There's a distinct tendency to stare. We hated being sent out to work. We became very weak from hunger. At night we stayed in positions, and during the day we were organized into work brigades and sent to the airfield. Digging deep trenches and hauling heavy boxes made us even weaker. One day, when we were returning from work, bombers suddenly appeared in the sky. While the bombs were still falling, I flew as if on wings into a coconut grove and fell into a newly dug trench with 3 other soldiers. I was crouched at the bottom of the trench, and everything was rumbling and rumbling around me. A young boy was sitting next to me, his face pressed against my bare back. I could feel his lips moving in prayer, a trembling kiss of faith and fear. When I returned to my foxhole, The guys told me that the batch of stragglers that went in front of us, I just didn't get there in time, had been destroyed by the bombing. A lot of our guys died there. Hotun became a corporal. He was awarded the rank on the battlefield. Lieutenant Ivy recommended him for awarding the Silver Star for the battle at Hell Point, especially noting that our maneuver, moving the machine gun from place to place, apparently thwarted the enemy attack from the flank. The regimental commander decided that a promotion would suffice. In his presentation, Lieutenant Ivy did not mention me, although the first introduced our machine gun Hotun, but still I suggested to drag it, and Ivy knew it very well. I was very offended that I was ignored, although I tried to hide it in every possible way. An embarrassed Ho-Hone tried to turn it into a joke, but he fully deserved both the promotion and the reward because he was a born leader. In my heart, I never forgave the offence to the lieutenant, and I think it was then that my dislike for him began. Mosquito nets were delivered to us. We still slept on the ground. If it was dry, we slept on the raincoat. If it was raining, we slept under it. But it was easier with the nets. Now we could use the blankets for their intended purpose. To sleep on them or to cover ourselves, but not to wrap our heads in them to protect ourselves from nasty insects. The cloak could now be rolled up to form a pillow. But the nets arrived too late. Almost everyone already had malaria. We had some more supplies delivered. Each squad got a toothbrush, a pack of shaving blades, and a sweet bar. We drew them in a dice game. The runner won the candy bar. He agonized over his inability to divide it among 10 people for a long time, until we persuaded him to eat it himself. To do this, he got out of sight and hid in some bushes. Stump continued to build and fortify his personal fort. Whenever I saw him, he had either an axe in his hand or a log on his shoulder. One day he carried such a huge log that it injured his shoulder, leaving a deep wound. In peacetime, such a wound would have had to be stitched up. Everyone kept saying that the army infantry was about to replace us, literally next week. Everybody was desperate. We heard that the army units heading our way had been destroyed at sea. Hotun and I visited the cemetery. It was a little south of the coastal road running west to east through groves of coconut palms. We knelt to pray at the graves of people we knew well. Their graves were mostly just decorated with palm fronds, although there were some hastily made crosses with identification tags nailed on them. On some of the crosses were fixed tin medallions made from tin cans, on which someone's caring hands had inscribed touching epitaphs. He died fighting. A real Marine. A big guy with a big heart. Our buddy. The harder it got, the more fun he had. There was another quatrain that I've seen countless times, a Marine's soul cry. When he comes to the top, he'll report to St. Pete. Sir, another Marine has finished serving in hell. Other inscriptions, most often the names of the dead, were made as follows. Cartridges were driven into the ground so that the round brass end remained above the surface. Hotun and I wandered around the cemetery and then decided to look around. A perfectly flat plain stretched far into the hills. Hotun made a face and announced, "There's plenty of room here." "That's right," I confirmed. Then we prayed at the grave of a guy from our platoon. "You know," Hotun said, standing up, "he had $200 in front of Hell Point. He won it in a poker game." "So what?" "And when they buried him, they didn't find a dime. We tried our best to kill a rat that was infesting our firing point. We swore we'd kill it and eat it for fresh meat. It had a habit of running through the embrasure, and it moved so fast that we thought it was flying. She was getting fatter and fatter, and we were getting weaker from hunger. In the end, it even stopped running and began to wander at a walking pace. We never caught it, and even if we had, I doubt we would have eaten it. One night we were shelled by enemy cruisers approaching the shore. One of the shells fell into the dark river water not far from us. The trench shook as if it had been dug in jelly. At first no one uttered a word, and only after a few seconds Bezody announced hopefully, "It didn't explode." "Haven't you ever heard of delayed action fuses?" giggled someone from the darkness. Everyone laughed, and Bezody sighed heavily and very resentfully. Another time, the night was surprisingly dark. We sat in the trenches and listened to the noise of battle coming from the hills to our right. We had received our orders and were ready to attack. All night we expected an attack. And in the morning we heard that the first part of the Battle of Bloody Ridge had been completed. The Japanese had been driven back. When night fell, the fighting resumed, and we scattered again in the dark trenches and waited. This time no rifle shots were heard, only artillery. We sincerely hoped it was ours. We carefully looked for any signs of the enemy in front of our positions, and sometimes for this purpose we even got out of the trench and crawled to the bank of the river. We could see better from there. Somewhere there, in the darkness of the night, a battle was going on. Our artillery was now shelling our own positions, abandoned by the Marines and occupied by the enemy. The sight of the barrage, the rampart of fire, was more than impressive. I was pretty far away, but my teeth were getting dusty. The morning was a real blessing. It dispelled without a trace the fear that the Japanese would break through our defences and pour into the grove. We knew the Japanese were defeated. Strangely, this knowledge did not bring relief. The big man explained this strangeness the next day. We gathered in the shade of a single tree on the riverbank. The big man sat leaning against the thick trunk and playing with his stick. He carefully trimmed the stick with a sharp knife, slicing off slivers of white wood, and spoke without addressing anyone in particular. He didn't even seem to care if anyone could hear him. "They're going to crush us to powder," he said, mouthing the words to the beat of the flying splinters. "They attacked the pilots last night, and then it will be our turn. We'll beat them, of course. Our boys are beating them so far, but we lose men every time we do. After every battle, there's a couple of 100 men in the ground. They have casualties too, but they don't care. Their lives are cheap. There are too many of them." He waved a neatly trimmed stick. "They have many sticks, and we have only one. A guy from the 5th came by today and said the Japanese unloaded 2 more troop transports at Kokuma. They are slowly but surely grinding us down. Every day we lose 10 to 20 men to bombing. Every night Charlie's washing machine takes a few lives too. When they bombard us from the sea again, there will probably be very few of us left. And they have everything they need to get what they want." He went on, and then he swore because his knife had hit a hard knot, if only because we have nothing. We don't have ships. We don't have airplanes, except for a few Gramaps, which most of the time can't take off because we don't have fuel either. They have ships, they have airplanes, and they seem to have plenty of time. So I'm telling you for sure. At this point the knife went too deep and the stick broke. Soon there will be nothing left of us here. Hotun decided to reduce the conversation to a joke. "What's your problem? We seem to be doing fine so far. What do you want? Go back to civilization and get in a long line for war bonds? What do you miss? Bird milk?" "Don't be an ass, Chuckles. I'm not kidding. They're going to wipe us all out sooner or later." "I don't want bird's milk," said the runner. "I want beer. Cold beer in a tall, thin glass. Carling's Black Label." The big guy stood up, looked at us angrily, and without a word stepped aside. He slowly walked away, and we sat there in silence. We felt like theology students whose professor had urgently taken a leave of absence, presenting us with the most convincing evidence that there was no God. We believed in victory. There was no question about it. No one thought of defeat. There would be victory, that was certain. Another question is whether it will be easy or difficult, quick or prolonged, but it will be. And then the big guy suddenly came out and decided to show us the other side of the coin, defeat. What we heard shocked us. From then on, we began to understand what acceptable casualties are. All armies know what an acceptable loss is. It is a part whose destruction would not be fatal to the whole. Sometimes a man may consider the loss of a finger but not a hand, or the loss of a hand but not a head, as acceptable. There are things that can be lost or destroyed, whether there is peace on earth or war, and their replacement is not strictly necessary. It could be a rifle, a cartridge case, or a person. Humans are the essence of expendable material. Hunger and jungle, the Japanese or all of them combined, do not destroy the psyche as much as the consciousness that you are cannon fodder. With no will of your own, I have no doubt whatsoever that if the Marines were looking for volunteers for an impossible mission, everyone fighting on Guadalcanal would step forward without hesitation. But it's a sacrifice, and it's voluntary. When you think of yourself as expendable, it deprives you of the triumph of self-denial, the absolute freedom of self-sacrifice. If you are cannon fodder, then you are not a hero who voluntarily sacrifices himself, but a victim, and this cannot but humiliate you. Personally, I doubt that Isaac accepted the knife of his father Abraham without judgment, without reproach. but at the same time he would have gladly died for him 1,000 times voluntarily. The world is full of the sacrifices of heroes and martyrs, but there is only one victim. Since we were to be victims, we held fast to our role, like Isaac to his bundle of brushwood. Not a day went by that we didn't talk about it. Lieutenant, when are we getting off this island? I have no idea. But you can ask the colonel. What makes you think he knows? This food's been rotting for a long time, Lieutenant. I know. But you'd better eat it anyway. No, so I can't eat this wormy rice. Eat it. But how can you expect us to? Eat it. I can't. I feel sick. Okay, then don't eat it. I think I have malaria. Here, feel my forehead. Damn, I'm afraid you're right. It's hot as hell. You should see a doctor. Well, what's the matter? What's the matter? All they'll give you is aspirin. And if it gets worse, they'll put you in a tent with other people who are just as sick. They won't send me home anyway. You can't leave the island. Nobody leaves. So there's no point in going to a doctor. Well, maybe you're right. Of course I'm right. So I'd rather suffer here with my friends. You can't leave this island anyway, not even in a box. That's why we have our own cemetery. It was very lonely. It was the loneliness of the night watch, during which you listen to the movement of the myriads of living things around you and try to catch the orderly sounds made by man behind the disorderly rhythm of nature. We languished quietly in the gaping hole of the trench, a constant rebuke to the world. In another sense, in a tearful and sentimental way, we had already begun to get used to the idea that we were all orphans. No one thought of us, no one needed us. Millions of Americans were going about their daily business, going to the movies, getting married, applying to colleges, going to stores and rallies, participating in pro-animal demonstrations, going to churches and cemeteries. In other words, everything in America was as it had always been, except that we weren't there and no one noticed. That's what we thought at the time. It seems very silly to me now. But back then it was exactly as I described. We felt alone and forsaken on the bank of the stinking river. But at last the time of the blessed change came. We were ordered to move to new positions. We left the river. We left without anyone noticing. We put our packs on our backs, our rifles on our shoulders, and walked over the wooden bridge past the crocodile rookery to the hills at the back of the island. It was a splendid, welcome respite. A walk through the fields became a day off in the middle of the work week, an escape from the sucking monotony. The fear was gone. We felt like members of an archaeological party or hunters. Only the complete absence of lights brought us back to reality. There was darkness, jungle and Japanese. Even the hellish heat that caught up with us in the Kupai thickets did not depress us in the slightest. Now we had dug a trench twice as big as the one we had left at Tenaru for ourselves and the machine gun, and we could rest quite comfortably. Our point was a real fort, about the size of a kitchen and about 2 meters deep. It was covered on top by a double layer of logs, a layer of earth as high as a glass and deer eye, which sprouted as soon as we laid it down, dragged in from a distance of about 30 meters. From afar, our firing point looked like an ordinary hillside. We felt under pad-eye protection and were sure that only a direct hit by a bomb or shell from the sea could threaten us. Everything else was provided for. Retreating behind the fences, we busied ourselves with the tropical sores. This was the name we gave to all sores that got wet or festered, especially those near the bones. There were a few among us whose feet and hands were not yet covered with these red and white foci of pee. Red from blood, white from pus, and often surrounded by black rims of sucking flies. Yes, here we lived almost in luxury. We even had beds. A large supply of Japanese ropes was found in the area where we were stationed. With the help of them, we built for ourselves beautiful beds by digging logs into the ground and laying rope mattresses on top of them. What a marvel! What exquisite comfort! Dry, warm, and above ground. No voluptuary on downy feather beds and thin sheets has ever experienced such an amazing pleasure. Even if he has a bell cord at hand, pull it and anything you want will be brought, and a lovely guria is curled up at the door. Chuckles and Biggie slept next to each other. They had built their beds close together. The rest of the partners did the same, like Runner and me, for example. As we lay there and whispered quietly to each other, we could hear a land crab wading through the thick grass. Then we heard Biggie snoring. We stopped whispering and waited in silence. There was silence, like a pause between pieces of music. And as it did not last long, it was broken unmercifully by another thunderous snore of York, a burst of laughter of Hohan, and an unbelievably loud stomp of a crab rushing to a safe hiding place. "Damn it, Hotun, that's not funny." "What's the matter with you, Hotun? What's wrong?" That's when Runner entered the conversation, his voice shaking with barely restrained laughter. "Hey, it's the crab again. Biggie's personal crab. He crawled through the barbed wire again and pinched Zoroviak's ass." Big Guy's response must have shocked the chaste knight. Another burst of laughter softened the offence and proved so infectious that even the big guy couldn't stay away and was soon laughing along with everyone else. What fear can we talk about? Our pilots fought in spite of the obvious superiority of the enemy in the air. Short aerial skirmishes over Hepterson Field were fought almost daily, and since we were in close proximity, everything happened, you might say, over our heads. But our fear of enemy planes was so strong that we did not crawl out of our shelters while bomb explosions or volleys of anti-aircraft batteries were still heard somewhere. Only Swordman continued to persistently marvel at the exhilarating show. During the raids he sat on the roof of our trench and watched the events unfold with all his eyes like a child in a circus, without hiding. Even if the bombs were bursting dangerously close to us, he supplied us with detailed descriptions of the progress of the battle. "Wow, guys, one's going down." At the same time, we heard the rumble of a rapidly approaching airplane. Then came a heavy thud. "Wow, that's at least 200 kilograms. Hey, Chuckles, Lucky, come up here. You're gonna miss the best part." "Damn it, we're fine here," said Hohatun, and then asked, "Who fell?" "Yes, ours." We looked at each other in surprise, and Runner concluded, "That bastard doesn't seem to care who wins. Look, they're gonna get them. The Japs are getting away, and ours are chasing them." Sometimes, when we were really annoyed by these cries, or when the bombs exploded very close to us, someone couldn't stand it and shouted, "Hey, swordsman, come downstairs. And hurry up, asshole, before you get your ass shot off." Sword always reacted the same way. "So what? They can shoot it off down there. What's the difference? If you're destined for something, you'll get it anyway. Hide, don't hide. When your time comes, the inevitable will happen, so why worry about it?" With him, as well as with his other fellow fatalists, no one tried to argue. Belief in fate was in vogue on Guadalcanal. In different ways, they said the same thing. Everything is written in destiny. Why worry? You'll be gone when it's your time anyway. Poor Billy. But you can't escape your fate. Oh boy, it's gone. I was beginning to think it was my time. You can't argue with fatalists. You can argue your position all you want, but people like Swordface will still be walking around under bombs. Tell them that they are disbelievers at heart, claiming that each person only leaves when they are meant to, no sooner and no later. Affirm that they themselves, by their own stupid stubbornness, choose their own time, with their own hands pull the paper with their name on it out of the hat. In other words, they are their own executioners. Remind them that even if they want to believe in fatalism, contrary to common sense, they must have a choice. Even the lack of choice must be chosen. Arguments like this are a great way to kill time while bombs are falling all around, and Swordman, the annoying fatalist to one and all, sits alone at the top. Bloody idiot. On a particularly hot afternoon, I climbed out of the trench and collapsed on the grass in the shade of a stunted bush for a nap. I woke up to the ground shaking beneath me. I woke up sweating with fear. The ground was shaking. I knew it was an earthquake, and I was horrified at the thought that it might open up and swallow me. When it did not do so, I was very disappointed, and I did not see any great crevices. I imagined my doom as follows. The earth opens up, the last betrayal, there is a void under my feet, and then eternal fall. My stomach rumbled so loudly with hunger and gas that I kept the Runner awake. He often mistook the sounds of my insides for the shelling from the sea. One night I woke up and saw him hurriedly getting out of his sleeping bag and running into the trench. "Alarm," he shouted. "Alarm! The shelling is starting." "Hey, Runner," I called out. "Don't wake anyone and go to sleep yourself. It's not enemy ships, it's my stomach." He came back, cursing me, but without malice. Runner had good reason to fear shelling when he heard the muffled murmur. As we moved into the interior of the island, we had time to experience the delights of the process. The ground shook from the bursting of heavy shells, and here it was felt much more strongly than on the river. The first volley was as sudden and unexpected as an earthquake. No one ever heard the deafening pa-boom from the sea or the whistle of a flying shell. It all started with the deafening rumble of an explosion, breaking the night silence and throwing us out of sleep. Swearing desperately, we rushed in the darkness to the trench, jostling at the entrance like New Yorkers in the subway. Another night lost, another dream sacrificed to the enemy. They will grind us to powder. We had already been on Guadalcanal for almost 2.5 months when we had to endure the heaviest night bombardment. I remember that night very well because I almost gave in to panic. The rumble of the explosion broke into a deep night's sleep so suddenly that I could not pull myself together at once. It seemed to me that a shell had exploded in my pocket, and if I hadn't been blown to pieces by it, I was sure I would be blown to pieces by the next one. I clutched desperately at my mosquito net. I struggled to break through it, to get through that thin web at all costs. Then another shell fell, no closer than the previous one, and I took a breath and stood still for a moment, trying to cope with the panic that had seized me. I got myself out of the mosquito net and cautiously rose to my feet. I stood motionless for a few moments and then walked toward the trench. The shelling had been terrible, but I had slept through most of it. As I gained control of myself, I gained confidence and even relaxed. I was no longer afraid, so I slept. On the bank of the Ilu, Herhun discovered a papaya tree. We ate its fruit early in the morning before breakfast, while it was full of juice and the night chill. On hearing of the find, Lieutenant Ivy asked to share it with him, but we had already eaten it all, and then he organized a detachment to search for this delightful fruit. Papaya was never found again on the banks of the Ilu. But we did find something better. It turned out you could swim here. We posted sentries on the shore and enjoyed splashing in this delightful river. It was in it that we swam and even drank the water the day we landed. It was just as clear and cool and just as pleasantly caressing to hot, tortured flesh. The tropics have their own painkillers that are unique to the area. Such are, for example, cool coconut milk or small clear rivulets running down from the hills. It is the latter, the Ilu and Lunga, that have kept us healthy. I cannot confirm my words with statistics, but from my observations, those of us who frequently bathed in them were less prone to ulcers and malaria. But our secondary discovery of Ilu came too late. We had only a week to enjoy its cool charms, after which the order came again to move to new positions. The army is here. Like hell it is. I said they're here. I saw it myself. Chuckles gesticulated furiously with one hand, the other holding a white sack slung over his shoulder. I was down on the shore at Lunga Point, and I saw them disembark. What was in the sack? Runner was curious. Chuckles grinned. He squatted down. We all did that when it was muddy, and there was nothing to sit on. I'd never seen anything like it. I was down on the beach just at the point where the Lunga flows into the bay, and I saw the ships. They were putting people on landing craft and they were heading for the shore. Those who were already ashore were crowding around coconut palms. Suddenly someone sounded the alarm. Poor guys, I felt sorry for them. The night before, they'd gotten the full brunt of it. The naval bombardment had been organized just for them. I had heard that the Japs had come too late to sink the transports and had thrown all their forces at the airfield, but still no one had been hurt. Although no one was hit, the puppies had to endure some very unpleasant moments. Be that as it may, the conditions were not suitable for an air raid, and they began to frantically scramble for cover. Then one of the officers had a brilliant idea, and it was decided to hide in the jungle. Crestfallen's face wrinkled. It had to be seen. It was impossible to describe. No sooner had the puppies hidden than a whole horde of our Marines came rushing out of the jungle. It was like someone had planned the whole thing. The puppies hid in the jungle. The planes flew by and went to bomb the airfield, and on the other side our iron asses came out of the jungle and started to drag everything that the army men had thrown. When we called a halt, they went back into the jungle, and the coconut grove looked like a hurricane had blown through it. When the splinters returned, they found they had lost half their supplies. That's the kind of comedy the Marines really respected. You're telling me you watched the whole thing happen? Big Guy asked in disbelief. Hell, of course not. I only watched as they came spilling out of the jungle. When I saw what they were doing, I immediately joined in. And what did you get? Crestfallen put a sack, also stolen, and displayed the loot. Judging by what he saw, he appeared to be a very judicious thief. There was nothing useless, reminiscent of a distant home, like electric shavers, gold rings or wallets, just things chainless in our possession. Socks, T-shirts, bars of soap, boxes of crackers. That's exactly what Hutton stole, and we applauded him wholeheartedly. This must be how Robin Hood's men must have sung the praises of Little John after he returned from his thieving raid on Nottingham. A few hours later, we learned that the soldiers who had arrived were to take our places. This we could not help but rejoice at. Their arrival on Guadalcanal meant that we were no longer cut off. After that, contact with the outside world became a matter of routine. We were no longer haunted by the fate of Wake Island. The fleet was back. The worst thing that could happen to us now was Dunkirk. So we were genuinely pleased with the soldiers who came up to our trench. They came after another air raid, a very close one. But they were not yet poisoned like the rest of us. War was still something exciting, romantic, partly even amusing to them. Their faces were round and fat, their ribs didn't bulge, and their eyes remained innocent. They were all older than we were, about 25 years old. We averaged 20, but we treated them like unreasonable children. I remember that two of them, when they heard about Eli, immediately went for a swim, not paying much attention to the barbed wire, as if they were visiting botanists rushing into the field for the right weed. I shouted at them to come back immediately. Honestly, I don't know why. It probably seemed to me that they didn't have the proper respect for danger. The barbed wire seemed to them to be an obstacle course and the jungle a picnic area. Their curiosity was childlike. They had an unwavering belief that everything would be fine, and they laughed at my gloomy premonitions. "Get your asses back here right now." I yelled, losing patience, and they came back. Their officer approached and asked what had happened. I explained, showing clearly exaggerated concern, that some bombs had fallen in the jungle that hadn't exploded and could very well be time bombs. He thanked me, I thought, sincerely and warmly. "Thank God," he said, "that you know all this." I felt like a small-time crook. So we said goodbye. They stayed in our positions in our well-equipped trenches, on our magnificent beds, protected by our barbed wire fences and next to the cool ILU, and we began to climb into the waiting trucks. We had already had our time on the sandy ocean shore by the silted-up river in the thickets of the Kupai. Now we had to familiarize ourselves with the mountain ranges. We climbed higher and higher, the road on which the trucks were traveling, winding its way to the top like a crawling snake. Finally, we were at the very top and were ordered to get out.